I never knew that a dusty old deed hidden in my grandfather's attic would change my life. But that's exactly what happened when the Coastal Vista Homeowners Association decided to mess with the wrong family. My name is Oliver Nielsen, and this is the story of how a power-hungry HOA president named Karren built luxury beach houses on my family's ancestral land, and how I let them dig their own graves before I showed them what true ownership means. Growing up in Seacliff County, Oregon, I always knew my family had deep roots in the area. My great-great-grandfather Jeremiah Nielsen had been one of the original settlers, arriving from Denmark in the 1880s and establishing a homestead on a magnificent stretch of coastline. The family story was that he'd purchased several acres of prime oceanfront property, but over the generations, most of it had been sold off as the family fortunes waxed and waned. By the time I inherited my grandfather's modest bungalow in 2020, it sat on what I thought was just a half-acre lot with beach access. It wasn't until I was cleaning out his attic after his funeral that I found an old metal lockbox containing documents I'd never seen before. "What's this?" I muttered to myself, brushing away decades of dust. Inside was a brittle yellow deed dated 1889 with elaborate calligraphy declaring Jeremiah Nielsen the rightful owner of 27 acres of coastal lands, extending from Haystack Point to Seal Rock Cove. I spread the ancient document carefully on the kitchen table, alongside a modern map of the area. If this deed was legitimate, my family still owned not just my grandfather's half-acre, but a stunning stretch of undeveloped coastline that extended nearly a quarter-mile in each direction, land that included what was now being marketed as the Tideline Estates, an exclusive development of million-dollar homes being built by the Coastal Vista HOA. The following morning, I contacted Harriet Wilson, a local real estate attorney whose family had been in Seacliff County almost as long as mine. "This is extraordinary, Oliver," she said, examining the deed through her reading glasses. "Property records from this era can be complicated, but this appears to be the original land grant signed by the county commissioner. Have you had the chain of title researched?" "No," I admitted. "I just found it yesterday. My grandfather never mentioned owning more than the house lot." "That's because he might not have known," Harriet explained. "Back then, property boundaries were often described in relation to natural landmarks, and record-keeping wasn't always meticulous. Let me look into this for you." While Harriet began her research, I decided to check out the Tideline Estates development myself. I drove down the winding coastal road and pulled into a newly paved entrance marked by a stone sign bearing the Coastal Vista HOA logo. Construction was already underway on 7 sprawling beach houses positioned to maximize ocean views. A woman in a tailored pantsuit approached my truck, her platinum blonde hair styled in the distinctive "Can I speak to the manager" cut that seemed to be the uniform of HOA presidents everywhere. "Hello there," she called with practiced enthusiasm. "Are you interested in becoming part of our exclusive community? I'm Karren Blackwell, president of the Coastal Vista Homeowners Association. I decided not to show my hand just yet." "Maybe," I said casually. "Nice location you've got here." "The best in Oregon," Karren preened. "We acquired this pristine stretch last year. Each home comes with private beach access and unobstructed ocean views. They're going quickly. We've already sold 4 of the 7 properties." "Who did you buy the land from?" I asked innocently. Karren waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, it was part of an old tax auction, abandoned property that nobody claimed for decades. The county practically gave it away. Lucky for us." She handed me a glossy brochure. "The remaining units start at $1.7 million. We're very selective about our residents, of course. The HOA ensures that our property values stay high and our community standards remain impeccable." I nodded, pocketing the brochure. "I'll think about it." As I drove away, my phone rang. It was Harriet. "Oliver, I've done some preliminary research, and this is absolutely fascinating," she said, her voice quickening with excitement. "Your family never officially subdivided or sold the majority of the original parcel. Your grandfather only recorded the half-acre surrounding the house as a separate lot. The rest has been sitting in a kind of legal limbo for decades, technically still owned by your family, but apparently forgotten. So how did the HOA get permission to build on it?" I asked. "That's where it gets interesting," Harriet continued. "The county incorrectly listed portions of the land as abandoned after your grandfather stopped paying taxes on the undeveloped sections, probably because he didn't realize he owned them. The HOA seems to have purchased tax certificates for those parcels. But if the county made a mistake, exactly, the tax sale would be invalid if we can prove continuous family ownership. Your 1889 deed might just be the key to establishing that the land was never legally abandoned." I thought about the construction already underway and the 4 homes Karren said were already sold. What should I do? March down there with my deed and tell them to stop building? There was a pause on the line. "Actually, Oliver, there might be a strategic advantage to letting them continue for now. If we alert them immediately, they'll fight tooth and nail to invalidate your claim. But if we gather more evidence and let them sink more money into the development first, they'll have more to lose," I finished her thought, precisely. "And potentially a stronger incentive to settle generously when you do assert your rights. But we need to move carefully. This kind of case can get complicated quickly." Over the next few weeks, Harriet dug deeper into the historical records while I kept tabs on the development's progress. The houses were rising quickly, ostentatious 3-story structures with floor-to-ceiling windows and expansive decks. I occasionally drove by, watching Karren Blackwell showing prospective buyers around what she didn't realize was my family's land. Meanwhile, I befriended Matthew Erickson, one of the construction foremen working on the project. Over beers at the local pub, he provided invaluable inside information. "Karren's a nightmare to work for," Matt confided one evening, nursing his second IPA. "Nothing's ever good enough, and between you and me, they cut some corners to get the permits through quickly." "What kind of corners?" I asked. Matt lowered his voice. "Environmental impact studies that should have taken months somehow got approved in weeks. The setbacks from the wetlands area are definitely not up to code, and I heard Karren bragging about having the county inspector in her pocket, whatever that means." This information added another layer to my emerging strategy. Not only might the HOA be building on land they didn't legally own, but they could also be violating environmental regulations. 6 months passed. 5 of the 7 beach houses were now completed, with owners already moved in. The remaining 2 were in the final stages of construction. Through careful observation and Matt's insider knowledge, I learned that the HOA had collected over $12 million from the sales, with each homeowner also committed to paying $2,000 monthly in HOA fees. Harriet finally called with conclusive news. "Oliver, we've got them. I've compiled a rock-solid chain of title showing your family's continuous ownership. The county's tax sale was completely invalid. They never had the right to sell what wasn't theirs to begin with. So what now?" "Now we make our move. I've prepared all the legal documents. We'll file a quiet title action asserting your ownership rights and seeking an injunction against further construction or sales." I took a deep breath. Let's do it. The following Monday morning, I accompanied Harriet to the county courthouse to file our case. By that afternoon, news had already spread through Seacliff's small legal community. My phone rang at exactly 5:17 p.m. "Is this Oliver Nielsen?" The voice was sharp, controlled but clearly agitated. "Yes, it is. This is Karren Blackwell from Coastal Vista Homeowners Association. I understand you've filed some kind of ridiculous claim against our development. This is obviously a mistake or a pathetic attempt at extortion. Either way, you need to withdraw it immediately." I couldn't help but smile at her predictable response. "Actually, Karren, there's no mistake. My family has owned that land since 1889. I have the original deed and complete chain of title to prove it." "That's absurd," she sputtered. "The county sold us those parcels legally. We've spent millions developing the property. We have homeowners living there now." "Yes, I know, that's unfortunate for everyone involved, but it doesn't change the facts. You built on land that doesn't belong to you." "We'll fight this," she threatened. "We have the best attorneys in the state. We'll bury you in legal fees." "You're welcome to try," I replied calmly, "but perhaps you should consider a more practical solution. I'm open to discussing terms." There was a long pause. "What kind of terms?" she finally asked. "Let's meet tomorrow. My attorney's office, 10 a.m. The next morning, Karren arrived at Harriet's office with two men in expensive suits: Thomas Reynolds, the HOA's attorney, and James Buchanan, the developer who had partnered with the HOA on the project. "This is preposterous," Reynolds began after cursory introductions. "Mr. Nielsen's claim is based on a century-old deed that has no bearing on current property records. The county legally sold these parcels to our clients." Harriet smiled patiently. "Actually, Mr. Reynolds, Oregon law is quite clear on this matter. The county cannot sell what it doesn't own. I've prepared a comprehensive title history showing unbroken ownership by the Nielsen family since 1889. The county incorrectly listed the property as abandoned when in fact, Mr. Nielsen's grandfather had never relinquished ownership of the larger parcel." She slid a thick folder across the table. "I've also included the survey reports matching the original property description to modern boundaries. As you'll see, all 7 of your beach houses are situated squarely on my client's land." Reynolds flipped through the documents, his expression growing increasingly concerned. James Buchanan wiped sweat from his forehead. "This is a nuisance lawsuit," Karren insisted, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "Even if there was some technical error in the county records, we've made substantial improvements to the property in good faith. You can't just swoop in and claim ownership now." "Actually, we can," Harriet countered. "Under Oregon law, building on someone else's land even in good faith doesn't transfer ownership rights. In fact, in some cases, the true owner can claim ownership of the improvements as well as the land." The color drained from Karren's face. "Are you saying he could take ownership of our houses?" "Theoretically, yes," Harriet confirmed, "though my client is willing to discuss a more equitable resolution." All eyes turned to me. I'd given this moment considerable thought, calculating not just what I could demand, but what would actually work for all parties. "Here's what I propose," I said. "First, the HOA and developer will pay me fair market value for the land, which current appraisals put at approximately $8.5 million. Second, I want 20% of all HOA dues in perpetuity, since those fees are directly tied to the value of access to my family's beachfront. Third, I want a public acknowledgement that this land has been in my family since 1889, perhaps with a plaque or monument near the entrance." Reynolds scoffed. "That's outrageous." "What's your alternative?" Harriet asked calmly. "Lengthy litigation during which construction must halt completely, having to explain to your buyers and residents that they may lose their homes. The negative publicity alone would devastate property values throughout all your developments." James Buchanan cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should consider Mr. Nielsen's offer, Karren. The financial terms are steep, but litigation could cost us everything." Karren's face flushed with anger. "This is nothing but extortion. We followed every legal procedure to obtain this land." "Except for verifying the actual ownership," I pointed out. "And speaking of legal procedures, I understand there might be some issues with the environmental impact studies and setback requirements for the wetlands area." Karren's eyes widened. She glanced nervously at her associates. "What is he talking about?" Reynolds asked. Before anyone could respond, I continued. "My friend at the EPA would be very interested in reviewing how those permits were approved so quickly, especially given the protected status of the coastal habitat." "We should talk privately," Buchanan muttered to Karren and Reynolds. They excused themselves and huddled in the hallway for nearly 20 minutes. When they returned, Reynolds spoke first. "We're prepared to counter with $5 million for the land, 10% of HOA dues for 20 years, and we'll consider some kind of historical marker." I shook my head. "Not enough. The land alone is worth more than that, especially now that it's been developed." After another hour of back-and-forth negotiation, we finally reached an agreement. $7.2 million for the land, 15% of HOA dues for 50 years, and a prominent historical marker acknowledging the Nielsen family's continuous ownership since 1889. I thought that would be the end of it. The settlement was signed, the money transferred, and life should have returned to normal. But Karren Blackwell wasn't finished. 2 weeks after our settlement, I received a certified letter informing me that as the originating property owner of land now incorporated into the Coastal Vista HOA, I was subject to all HOA rules and regulations, including restrictions on my grandfather's bungalow, which supposedly violated multiple aesthetic guidelines. "They can't be serious," I told Harriet over the phone. "My house existed long before their development. Unfortunately, there's some ambiguity in the settlement language," Harriet admitted. "We focused on the financial terms and didn't explicitly exempt your property from HOA jurisdiction. They're attempting to exploit that oversight." The letter detailed 12 violations, including my non-conforming fence design, unapproved exterior paint color, and excessive natural vegetation in the front yard. It demanded compliance within 30 days or daily fines would be imposed. "This is clearly retaliation," I fumed. "Karren's trying to make my life miserable because I stood up to her." "Most likely," Harriet agreed, "but rather than getting into another legal battle, let's try to resolve this through the HOA board." "Karren may be the president, but she still has to answer to other board members." I contacted the HOA board secretary, requesting to address them at their next meeting. To my surprise, they agreed. The meeting was held in the newly constructed Coastal Vista Community Center, an elegant building with panoramic ocean views that had been built on what was once Nielsen family land. About 30 residents attended, along with the 7 board members seated at a long table at the front. Karren sat in the center, wearing a smug expression as I approached the podium. "Members of the Coastal Vista community," I began, "my name is Oliver Nielsen. My family has lived on this coastline since 1889, long before this development existed. Recently, your HOA has attempted to force me to modify my historic family home to conform to your aesthetic guidelines. I'm here to explain why this is both unfair and impractical." I distributed copies of historical photos showing my grandfather's bungalow as it had stood for generations, along with documentation of its historical significance to the area. "Furthermore," I continued, "I'd like to clarify something that may not be known to all residents. Until recently, my family legally owned all the land your homes are built on, dating back to an original deed from 1889. Murmurs spread through the room as homeowners exchanged confused glances. The HOA purchased this land through what turned out to be an invalid tax sale. When I discovered this and presented proof of my ownership, we reached a settlement allowing the development to remain. Part of that settlement included acknowledgement of my family's historical connection to this property, which seems at odds with now trying to erase the last visible reminder of that history, my grandfather's original home." "This is inappropriate," Karren interrupted, her voice shrill. "Mr. Nielsen is attempting to relitigate a settled matter and spread misinformation about our community." One of the homeowners, an older gentleman in the second row, raised his hand. "I'd like to understand this better. Are you saying our homes were built on land that belonged to his family, not the county?" Karren tried to speak over him, but another board member, a woman named Elizabeth Chen, cut her off. "Actually, I'd like to hear the answer to that as well. Karren, you told us the land was acquired through normal channels from the county." "It was," Karren insisted. There was a minor technical issue with some old records, but everything was resolved legally. A minor technical issue, I echoed. The county sold land it didn't own, and you built 7 houses on it without conducting proper due diligence on the title. I could have pursued full ownership of all those houses under Oregon law, but instead, I agreed to a settlement that allowed everyone to keep their homes. The room erupted in concerned conversation. Another board member, Michael Townsend, called for order. "Mr. Nielsen, are you saying that without your agreement, our homeowners could have lost their properties?" "Potentially, yes," I answered honestly. "But that was never my intention. I just wanted fair compensation for my family's land and recognition of our historical connection to it. The idea that my home now violates HOA guidelines seems like retaliation, not legitimate community oversight." Elizabeth Chen turned to Karren. "Did the board vote on issuing these violations to Mr. Nielsen's property?" Karren shifted uncomfortably. "As president, I have discretionary authority to issue notices for clear violations. But his home predates our guidelines by decades," Elizabeth countered. "And if what he's saying about the land ownership is true, we owe him a debt of gratitude for not pursuing more aggressive legal action." Michael Townsend nodded. "I move that we immediately rescind all violation notices against the Nielsen property and establish a permanent exemption for historical structures predating our development." "I second that motion," Elizabeth quickly added. Despite Karren's protests, the motion passed with 5 votes in favor and only Karren and her closest ally on the board opposing. As the meeting concluded, several homeowners approached me, curious about the history of the land their homes now stood on. I shared stories my grandfather had told me about the coastline, the old fishing community that once thrived there, and how the Nielsen family had been stewards of the land for generations. "You should conduct historical tours," suggested one resident, a retired history professor. "Many of us would love to learn more about this area's past." The idea took root, and over the following months I began offering informal walking tours of the coastline, sharing my family's connection to the land. What started as occasional weekend excursions grew into a popular local attraction, with even some coastal Vista residents becoming regular participants. Karren, predictably, was furious about this development. She filed complaints with local authorities claiming I was conducting unauthorized commercial activity on HOA property. But since the beach itself remained public land under Oregon law, and I carefully stayed within legal access areas, her complaints went nowhere. The final showdown came 6 months later, when Karren attempted to block beach access from my property by constructing an environmental protection fence directly across the historical path that had connected my grandfather's house to the beach for generations. When I discovered the construction crew setting posts one morning, I immediately called Harriet and then the County Environmental Protection Office. "This pathway has existed for over a century," I explained to the county inspector who arrived that afternoon. "It's the original access point established by my great-great-grandfather in the 1880s, and it's carefully designed to minimize impact on the dunes." The inspector, Paula Ramirez, examined both the pathway and the partially constructed fence. "This fence installation doesn't have proper permits," she confirmed, "and it appears to intrude into protected dune habitat which requires special authorization." When Karren arrived, summoned by the construction foreman, she was livid. "This is HOA property," she insisted. "We have every right to secure it from unauthorized access." "Actually, Miss Blackwell," Paula replied calmly, "this specific dune area falls under county environmental protection. Any modifications require environmental impact assessment and proper permitting, which you haven't obtained. Additionally, under Oregon's beach access laws, historical pathways generally have protected status. Furthermore," Harriet added, having arrived moments earlier, The settlement agreement specifically preserves Mr. Nielsen's historical access rights. Section 7, Paragraph 3 explicitly states that all traditional and historical access points shall remain unimpeded. Karren's face contorted with frustration. "This isn't over, Nielsen," she hissed, before storming off to her luxury SUV, but it was over at least this particular battle. The fence was removed the following day, and the HOA board, increasingly wary of Karren's vendetta against me, began to scrutinize her actions more closely. 2 months later, I received a surprise visit from Elizabeth Chen and Michael Townsend, who had become allies of sorts on the HOA board. "We need to talk to you about Karren," Elizabeth began after I invited them in for coffee. "We've been reviewing the HOA financial records, and there are some concerning irregularities." Michael nodded grimly. "Large consulting payments to companies we can't verify, inflated maintenance contracts, and most troubling discrepancies in how the original development costs were reported to homeowners versus what appears in the actual records. We think she may have been skimming from both the development budget and the ongoing HOA funds," Elizabeth continued, "but we need more evidence before we can take action." I considered their words carefully. "What are you asking from me?" "Your settlement gives you the right to audit the HOA financial records related to your percentage of the dues," Michael explained. "We as board members can request audits too, but Karren has been blocking our efforts, claiming it's unnecessary spending. If you formally request an external audit, she can't easily refuse without raising even more suspicions." I agreed to help, and within weeks, a forensic accounting firm was combing through the Coastal Vista HOA records. What they uncovered was even worse than Elizabeth and Michael had suspected. Karren had created shell companies that received consulting fees for services never rendered. She had approved inflated construction costs and taken kickbacks from contractors. Most damning of all, she had misrepresented the total development costs to both homebuyers and the HOA board, pocketing nearly $2 million in the process. With the evidence in hand, the board called an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove Karren as president and refer the matter to law enforcement. The day after the vote, 2 detectives from the Seacliff County Sheriff's Office arrived at Karren's beachfront home with a warrant for her arrest. The case made headlines throughout Oregon. HOA president arrested for embezzlement and fraud. Karren faced multiple felony charges, and as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered evidence that she had bribed county officials to fast-track permits and overlook environmental regulations. In the aftermath of the scandal, the Coastal Vista HOA underwent a complete restructuring. Elizabeth Chen was elected the new president, with a platform focused on transparency, environmental stewardship, and community building. One of her first official acts was to approach me with an unexpected proposal. "The community wants to make amends for how you were treated," she explained during a meeting at my home. "We'd like to establish a Nielsen family heritage area near the entrance to the development, with educational displays about your family's role in settling this coastline. We're also proposing to name the community walking trail after your grandfather." I was touched by the gesture. "That's very thoughtful. It's the least we can do," she said sincerely. "Your family's connection to this land goes back generations. Instead of trying to erase that history, we should be honoring it." Over the following year, a remarkable transformation took place. What had begun as an adversarial relationship between me and the HOA evolved into a collaborative partnership. The Nielsen Heritage Area became a focal point of the community, drawing visitors from throughout Seacliff County. My historical walking tours became official community events, sponsored by the HOA. Karren Blackwell eventually accepted a plea deal, serving 18 months in prison for fraud, embezzlement, and corruption. The county officials who had accepted bribes faced their own legal consequences, leading to a broader reform of local permitting processes. As for me, The settlement funds allowed me to completely restore my grandfather's bungalow to its original glory, while establishing a foundation dedicated to preserving coastal heritage and environment throughout Oregon. The 15% of HOA dues provided ongoing funding for these conservation efforts. On the one-year anniversary of the heritage area's dedication, I stood before a gathering of Coastal Vista residents, local officials, and members of other coastal communities. The monument, a beautiful stone marker inscribed with the original 1889 deed text, and a relief map of the original Nielsen property, gleamed in the afternoon sun. My great-great-grandfather came to this coastline seeking a place where his family could put down roots and build a legacy, I told the assembled crowd. He couldn't have imagined the changes that would come over the generations, but I like to think he would approve of how things have turned out. This land has always been about community, from the small fishing settlement of the 1800s to your homes today. The Nielsen family may have held the deed for generations, but the true ownership of any place belongs to those who love it, care for it, and preserve it for the future. Elizabeth stepped forward to stand beside me. On behalf of the Coastal Vista community, we reaffirm our commitment to being good stewards of this remarkable place, honoring its past while building its future. The mistake that brought us together has become the foundation for something none of us could have imagined: a true community that respects its history even as it creates its own. As I looked out over the faces of people who had once been adversaries but were now neighbors, I felt a profound sense of rightness. The 7 beach houses that had been built without permission on my family's land now stood as beautiful homes for families who genuinely cared about the coastline's legacy. The HOA that had once tried to erase my grandfather's historic bungalow now helped preserve it as a living museum of coastal life. Later that evening, as sunset painted the ocean in breathtaking colors, I sat on my grandfather's porch, the same porch where he had told me stories about Jeremiah Nielsen's arrival on this shoreline. I held the framed 1889 deed in my hands, running my fingers over the faded ink that had changed everything. Sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't the land itself, but the connection to it, the knowledge that you are part of something that extends both backward and forward in time. The deed had given me legal ownership, but the true gift was understanding my place in the continuing story of this magnificent coastline. The HOA had built 7 beach houses on my family's land, thinking they owned something they didn't. I had let them sell those houses, knowing I held the true deed. But in the end, what we all discovered was something more valuable than property: a shared commitment to honoring the past while building a better future for this special place that, in the most important ways, belonged to all of us. As twilight deepened into night and stars appeared above the Pacific, I thought about how differently things might have turned out. Had I immediately confronted the HOA, had I been interested only in financial gain, had Karren not been so determined to maintain her power and profits, the story would have been one of conflict rather than reconciliation. Instead, a centuries-old deed had ultimately led not to division but to unity, not to the tearing down of homes but to the building of community. My great-great-grandfather would have approved. After all, he hadn't crossed an ocean and claimed this land just for himself, but for generations of Nielsens he would never meet, and now, in a way he could never have anticipated, for a broader family of people who had come to love this coastline as he had. The deed was important, but what mattered more was what we chose to do with it. And in that choice I found not just justice, but peace.